So I'm not actually going to talk about AI today. Well, I mean, I am going to talk about AI, but I'm not actually here to talk about AI. Well, let me get into it and see how it goes. So there's this thing that happens with generative AI like LLMs and such that's called model collapse. And what happens is if you take the output of some kind of AI generative system like ChatGPT or whatever, and then you feed it its own output as input, and then you take the output and feed it as input, take the output and feed it as input again and again, you end up with the AI's output getting increasingly weird and kind of hallucinatory and disconnected from reality and sort of Looney Tunes. And after a while, it just sort of falls apart. And this is becoming a big problem for the AI companies right now because they train their AIs by scraping people's websites. And a lot of people are writing websites using AI because they don't feel confident in their own writing ability. So they post blogs that are all AI slop or whatever. And then their blogs get scraped by the AI companies. And so the AIs re ingest their own output as input, and then the models just kind of fall apart. And this is actually the reason that companies like Anthropic are desperately scouring the world for books that they then pump into their AIs and destroy, because by destroying them, they can argue that they are making a copy of the book. And if they have purchased the book, like at a yard sale or something, they have the legal right to do that, and blah, 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 whatever. Anyway, the point is that AIs go through this model collapse when they re-ingest their own output as input over and over again. But that's actually not what I want to talk about. What I'm actually here to talk about is the sort of moral and ethical equivalent of model collapse that you get whenever you have some kind of tight knit, closed community that takes a moral position or an ethical position, and then it re-ingests its own output as input over and over and over again. And I've seen this happen. I have relatives who are part of the Quiverful cult, and you see this in cult behavior all the time. You also see this in things like small subcommunities. Like I've seen it happen in the kink scene, in the BDSM community. I've definitely seen the same thing happen in places like restorative or transformative justice communities. So what happens is you get a group of people who are committed to some kind of idea, usually a moral or ethical idea, whether it's religious or social justice or whatever it happens to be. And then they re-ingest this same idea over and over and over again. And what I mean by that is that the people in that community will keep making names for themselves or staking a claim to some sort of community status by creating ever more and more and more and more extreme versions of their moral beliefs or their ethical ideas. So that what happens is, without any realistic feedback from the outside world and without any realistic consequences to these ever more extreme ideas, you get sort of a moral model collapse where the moral systems themselves become increasingly black and white, increasingly polarized, increasingly weird, until they actually stop making any sense at all. It happens in cults when you get religious ideas that are taken to ever greater extremes, or you get people like, for example, interpreting the Bible in more and more and more weird ways. And why do people do this? Because the first person who states a religious or a moral or an ethical idea that starts getting traction gets a certain amount of status for it. And then it becomes more difficult for people who join that community to get that same level of status for themselves unless they take those moral ideas and stake out territory that nobody has staked out yet. So, for example, in religious communities that are, say, biblical literalist, you will get people making increasingly strange and kind of weird interpretations of their religious text, like the Bible, because by doing that, they gain status. They're like, look at me, I have figured this out, I understand God's word. And you get the same thing happening in subcommunities when people stake out increasingly weird and extreme ideas about whatever values their subcommunity holds. Like, for example, the kink scene is really big on consent and has been for a long time. And this really ought to be a gimme, right? Like, I mean, how many people out there are going to say, not me. I don't think that consent is all that big a deal. Nobody's going to say that. And even people who don't believe it aren't going to say it out loud. So you get a community and you get a bunch of people getting together and they're like, we do um, kinky sex, whatever, but we do it in a consensual way. Cool, awesome. So then how does the next person to come along stake some sort of territory in this community? And the answer to that is they do it by taking a more hardline stance on consent. Well, I believe in consent, and I believe that people who play or who engage in BDSM without safe words are violating consent, and that's bad. And then you'll get people saying, yeah, 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 go you, go you. You really care about consent. So he gains status in the community. He may gain, admirers, whatever. And then you get people who are like, all right, well, how can I get that status for myself in the community? And they say, well, all right, I'm going to say that I value consent, that people who play without safe words are bad, and people who engage in certain kinks that I find distasteful are bad. And one of the things that I've seen this happening with is a kink that's called somnophilia or sleep sex, where people will consent to have their partners have sex with them when they're asleep. And for most of my life, this has been, not really a mainstream kink, but it's been popular enough in the kink scene that, people really haven't thought that much about it. And lately, like in the last few years, I've seen people start saying, well, that's not consensual. You can't consent. And so anybody who does this is bad. And then there are other people who say, yeah, yeah, this guy really cares about consent. This guy's really into consent. Go you. And then you gain status and stature in the community. And I'm not actually here to talk about that particular kink either. It is a kink that I do, and I think I have the right to do it. I have an arrangement with two of my lovers that say, you are allowed to have sex with me when I'm asleep, and you don't need to ask me first. And since I really, really strongly believe in agency and personal autonomy, I believe that I have the right to do that. Now, if that's not your kink, cool, that's okay. I am totally fine with people who don't have the same kinks I do. But the thing is, when you start taking these increasingly hardline, harder and harder and harder, more extreme, more fundamentalist approaches to consent, you get this ethical model collapse. And after a while, you end up with subcommunities that start espousing ethics that actually not only don't make sense, they're contradictory to the ethics and morals that the community claims that it stands for. For example, bodily autonomy. If I want to say my lover can have sex with me while I'm asleep, and I do, that seems to me to be a basic part of bodily autonomy. And yet we see people who are starting to take a really hardline stance against this, just like there are people in the kink scene who take a really hardline stance against playing without safe words. And I think the parallels between this and AI model collapse are absolutely fascinating. They happen for exactly the same reason. And I've been thinking about this lately as I work on a book on social justice, a nonfiction book that I've been working on for a while. The first draft of it is finally done, woohoo! But I'm still working on it. But in that book, I actually sort of compare these ideas of ethical model collapse and AI model collapse. And I don't know, I just think there's something there.